So, EAV in Magento, that's the big boogeyman, scary. Why does this system have 420 tables? What could they possibly be doing in there? So, EAV, we want to talk about the concepts, actual entities themselves, and our resource model operations with those entities, as well as attribute management. Okay? Magento, once again, the ORM, they've given you a lot of the tools that you need to be able to use EAV entities, make your own attributes, and also adjust attributes of existing entities in the system. So, got a customer object that needs additional attributes, do that programmatically. Same for products, etc. Okay? Concepts and structure. We saw this earlier today. By the way, this is the third half of today's class. We saw this earlier today. Typical data storage. You know, each column is some datum about your entity, and each row is a complete set of information about your entity. So that's nice and simple. It's a little limiting, though, because if we need to have multiple scopes, how do we do that? We'd have to have our entity in here twice and then maybe have some sort of scope field here. But then okay, that'd be one solution. Adding and removing new fields. So yes, everyone did that with their first CMS application. They realized, oh, I'll need this other piece of information. So you tack on another column. How do you do that? How do you version that? Changing field types as well. So you have something that is a decimal and you want it to be an integer. Well, you know, that can be complicated. How do you version that? Again, EAV solves this problem. Not without complication, with a little bit of overhead, of course. But again, that's why we rely on what Magento built for us. So EAV solves this by separating attributes and giving them their own meta environment so that they themselves can be administered and we can have information about them. Separates these attributes from the entities. Okay, so we can say that an entity exists in our system without actually coupling it in a single table to all of its attributes. That also gives us the chance to introduce scoping of these attributes. Simply, for attribute options, provide alternate translations for different scopes, etc. And we'll be taking a look at that. And adding and removing attributes is very easy. Okay. There are some things to learn about doing this with Magento, but it's possible. And you don't have to adjust your models at all. So EAV storage, the idea is skinny tables, skinny long tables. So entity, this would be the thing in the system: catalog, product, catalog category, entity, and the static attributes. So this is the record that something exists, and probably should be scopeless data. Okay? Global data. Then we have information about attributes. So maybe there are different parameters that we need to consider for each attribute, such as models that should be used to render the attribute options, etc. And then they're linked in different tables. So they're separate tables, but they all really relate to the complete description, the complete storage of an entity. EAV, so we have this meta information about the entity type, attribute sets and groups, which I'll discuss in just a moment. So we have this information about the association between entities and the attributes and the organization of the attributes that apply to them. And then we also have the content itself. So that would be the entity records and then the values. So here's our data and here's our meta. All right, EAV hierarchy. Okay, so bear with me just a second. Entity type. So an entity has an entity type. Then there are also attribute tables. All right, so attributes. This is the important part of the slide. Attributes themselves are like their own little model world. They have back-end model, source model, and front-end model. Okay? The good news is, like, that's the end of the complexity here. That's a lot, I know. It's a whole other set. But back-end models used for saving attribute values. Source model used for rendering options. And front-end models used for rendering in the front end. Okay? Here we see attribute sets and attribute groups. Who here has seen the Manage Attributes panel or Manage Attributes page in Magento? Okay? And you've seen the Manage Attribute Sets. Okay, let's take a look at that so that we'll see what it is represented here, because this meta environment for catalog products actually has a face in the admin. It's possible via the admin panel to add new attributes to the catalog product entities, and you can also do it through upgrade scripts. If your module requires an attribute be added to catalog product entities, you would do that via an upgrade script or an install script, a setup script, because you don't want to rely on users setting it up correctly here, nor would you want them to have the ability to remove that and potentially break your module. So, attributes, let's see, manage attribute sets. Okay, so here we have attribute sets. All right? Mm-hmm. Now, if I click on, let's say, the default set, here I have attribute groups. Here are the attributes over here. Mm-hmm. So groups are nothing but just an arrangement inside of sets for attributes. And that's the end of that story. So you would take your attribute, put it over here, and assign it to a particular group. And these items with the red here, those cannot be removed. That's what we would want if our module has an attribute that's required for the catalog product entity. We'd want it to be like that, not an attribute added through the system, through the admin, that could be removed. So, what does that look like in the database? Obviously, this information has to be stored somewhere. So, we have EAV entity type. So we could set up something like, let's look at these tables in the database. So EAV attribute, well, that's the attributes themselves. And then we have sets and groups, entity types, and then EAV entity attribute is where everything comes together. So in the database, we have, let's see. All right. Let's see. EAV entity type. Type codes. So customer address. These are all of the EAV entities in the system. Okay. Or entities in the system, actually, I should say. Okay, well, that's interesting. So something like customer, that's an EAV entity. Catalog product, okay, yeah. So here is some meta information about each of these entities. Okay. And
So entity underscore type underscore I code, right?
EAV entity type.
Okay.
That was this table. And then, yes, the code here. Okay, now we also have EAV attributes, or EAV attribute. and these are the attributes in the system. And you see here, it can be associated with an entity type. So a code which should be unique, and then here we also have some additional information: back-end model, front-end model, our input, labels, etc., and a source model.
So the first table you show us is EAV entity type, right?
Yep.
Okay. So what do we, I mean, is there any relationship between these two?
Yeah, sure.
What?
I mean, the attributes are associated with the entity types, and that's how the values, that's how we know that
Oh,
that
so
we're,
second column.
right.
Okay.
Okay? Now, this system, like I mentioned, this has all gone through a big evolution. So we have, for example, EAV entity here. Yeah, we have some legacy tables here that no longer apply. EAV entity date time, empty, EAV entity decimal. It's legacy data, or legacy structure. So, all right. So that's a little tour day EAV meta environment. As I mentioned, main table. So catalog product entity, right? And then catalog product entity int, decimal, varchar, text, datetime. Okay. That is the complete record of the object in the system.
Since we missed something about how do you decide to create the EAV table for the entity table?
We'll get into that.
Okay.
So for right now, just recognize this as an EAV data store, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then abruptly shifting gears, jumping guns. So the entity type description, so the entity type table, EAV entity type table, we get our primary key, and then we get a code that we use as an identifier, and this we'll actually use in upgrade scripts. We can specify a default attribute set, and the current increment ID and a specific increment model. I don't think we'll have time to go into that. Let's see. All right. So consider again we're dealing with entities and attributes, and this is obviously not a complete description of the table, but these are the important features of that table. Now we also have the attributes. So attribute code, backend type, backend model, source model, front-end model. These are important things that we'll actually be discussing here and using as we add attributes to entities. Okay? Now, EAV process. Okay. So what does this all mean when it comes time to either gather or store information or options? Well, all right, in the context of the entity, we get the attribute model. So for each entity, we actually have, in EAV entities, we actually have the attribute as access to the attribute model. And again, that model is very complex. It has source, backend, and front end. So the source, again, used for rendering options. And the backend is used for storage. Okay. So obviously, we're at a fairly high level looking at this system, and this is actually this is about as deep as we go. The nice thing, of course, is that we have a way using core Magento classes and also storing information about our attributes. We have a way to customize source models, back-end models, and front-end models. So we're not limited to just the set that Magento provides. This will be on the final exam. You don't have to know this to use EAV entities. It's just to show you that there is this fairly complex little environment going on to facilitate EAV representation and storage. All right. Here we see this little section that we reviewed earlier, and that's about all I'll discuss here. So yeah, just be aware that it's there are a lot of classes that link up to provide you the functionality that you need. It's very rare that you have to go very far down this path to do what you need, and we'll see examples of this as part of our exercises. So, all right, we had this slide earlier today in the first half or second half. The resource model and the resource collection, and the model, database adapter and storage. Well, with EAV entities, we introduce the entity type and an attribute model. What does that look like? Well, okay, resource model, resource collection, and then we have the attribute model and the attribute groups and the attribute sets. Okay, so that's what we're looking at an example of that in our in the managed sets. All right. And then we add backend models, source models, and front-end models for our attributes. And then, of course, because we're representing, we have to access the groups and the sets, we need collections and resources. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So it's pretty colorful in here, isn't it? The nice thing is that we don't really have to do much with this. Okay. Pretty much we deal with resource models and collections, and we deal with the back-end source and front-end models, the attributes. That's the nice thing. And that is your overview of EAV. I know. You may have heartburn now. But that's okay. Let's see. That would be EAV entity attributes. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, well, for those of you who haven't seen a product being administered, so if we go to add a product, so what's the connection between attribute sets and a given product? Well, right here, when we say product type, that's also that's an attribute set. Oh, I'm sorry, no, not product type, attribute set. That's the attribute set. So this just simply sets up the attributes and the arrangement of attributes that we have for a given product. Obviously, what's the whole purpose? Like, why would we have this? Well, we could be selling shirts and shoes, or we could be selling shirts and pants, and maybe we have small, medium, large shirts and small, medium, large pants. Those are different, small, mediums, and larges. So we can actually separate out what we want to store. So we don't need to store, for example, here we have computers and shirts. Well, we obviously wouldn't want to store like RAM information about shirts. It's not, the 22nd century yet. I'm sure shirts will have RAM at some point, but it's only a matter of time. Yeah, so that's the whole point of that system, okay? Now, let's see here. So, So EAV entity attribute. All right. Attribute set ID. Here's the association. All right.
No, but where the association with the product being
Entity?
flat and the
Let me see.
no, because that is if you go to catalog probably
Catalog product entity.
yeah, that's where the association with
Yes.
I think that's what it was.
Ah, yes. Yes. So if you look in, where's catalog product entity? There we go. And then attribute set ID here.